The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio with Dr. Alex Heublein and Dr. Josh Klapow. This is Adapt or Perish.
Welcome to Adapt or Perish. I'm Dr. Josh Klapow along with Dr. Alex Heublein, president of Adaptigent. Damn it, you did it to me again. You brought it back in, Mr. Roboto. God, Alex. And I love Styx. I guess we're going to agree to disagree. No, I love this topic because machine learning and artificial intelligence, they literally have become both. They exist and they are used. They are used so liberally in branding and marketing that I don't know. It makes me nauseous because everything has become machine learning and artificial intelligence, no matter what you're doing. So today on Adapt or Perish, enlighten us on what you really think is artificial intelligence and machine learning, and really how we should be thinking about this beyond the, what looks great on your website and your marketing and promotional materials.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think it's worth kind of taking a step back on this and kind of looking at the history of it. When I was in high school, I decided.
Did they have machines still in computers?
They had machines. Yeah, they weren't very intelligent back in the day, but this was back in the late 80s, and I went off to college, majoring in computer science, and I said, I want to do artificial intelligence. That's what I want to specialize in. Because I saw computers when I was a kid. I think I got my first computer when I was like 10 years old. And I thought, this is just amazing. You can make these things do just about anything you tell them to do. It's hard. You've got to write code and you've got to go be very meticulous about it and whatnot. But at the end of the day, I looked at it and said, wow, this is amazing. This is something that we've never seen before. And so when I went off to college, I thought, if we could teach these machines how to figure out things on their own, that's the next level of this. It's not just about telling computers what to do in a certain order and they go out and execute those things for you. It's about teaching machines how to learn and how to act more like people. Now, I got into it back in the late 80s, and I remember taking my first artificial intelligence class, and I think I got a B in it. And I thought, God, this sucks. You can't really teach these things how to do much of anything with the tools at the time. And it was really terrible because the idea was that you were going to go teach the machines a bunch of rules. Almost like, well, we're going to go out and teach the machine how to play chess. And we're going to do that by teaching it the rules of chess. And then we're going to teach it some strategies for how to go out and execute against those rules in an optimal way. And that went on for, at least 20 years, where we came up with these expert systems. We tried to create these robots, almost like Mr. Roboto, that were there to do our bidding, and they had some degree of intelligence. They could look at these rules that they had, and they could infer other rules based on the rules we gave them. But at the end of the day, they still couldn't do much. They still couldn't even translate speech correctly, speech to text type stuff. That took a long, long, long time to get right. And so I got out of it. I was like, no way, this just isn't where I thought it was going to be. I thought I was going to be making these super advanced robots and artificially intelligent systems. And that turned out not to be the case. Now, if you fast forward 20, 25 years, one of the big differences today in artificial intelligence, and in particular in machine learning, is that the way we go about doing it is very different. The computer scientists, I guess, got together with the psychologists and the psychiatrists, and they said, man, this ain't working. And so the approach that we take today is very different. We actually teach machines in a very similar way to the way we teach children, particularly at a young age. So I have a 5-year-old, and I've spent the last 5 years, I call him my little artificial intelligence experiment. Because
by the way, I did the same thing with both of my kids, and I'm a psychologist. We ran all kinds of experiments. They're 20 and 22. They're both still alive and reasonably well psychologically adjusted. Continue.
Yeah, and it's fun because you get to do these little experiments with kids, right? And you get to put things in front of them. And if you know something about psychology and you know something about artificial intelligence, it's really fun. I mean, it may not be fun for them. I mean, they're not terrible experiments or anything, but you'll give them these little tasks, or you'll ask them to do things, and they'll do things, and then you get to observe and go, oh, that experiment didn't quite go the way I thought it was going to go. Mm-hmm. So I've had a lot of fun with it because I know a bit about how kids learn things, and I know a lot about how computers learn things these days. And it turns out they're very, very similar. So instead of teaching the kid a bunch of rules at an early age, like let's just take speech, for instance. You don't have to teach kids explicitly how to speak. They just pick it up from their environment, right? They watch you or your wife or your partner or whatever, and their friends, and they watch television and they watch videos on YouTube or whatever, and they just pick up on it. They just learn by example. If you show them enough examples of speech and correct speech, for the most part, they'll learn how to speak correctly. And so we do something very similar with computers these days. So instead of saying, well, here, let's say we wanted a computer that could recognize birds in a photo, photos of birds versus photos of things that kind of sort of look like birds. Well, you don't teach them that birds have wings and birds have a beak and so on and so forth. What you do is you just show them a bunch of pictures of birds, and then you show them a bunch of pictures of things that kind of look like birds but aren't birds. And then you tell them that one's a bird, that one's not a bird. And amazingly, with the machine learning software and hardware that we've built, it kind of mimics the human brain. It just picks up on the pattern. And that's really neat when you start to teach computers things. So you teach them by example rather than teaching them by a bunch of rule sets. So we've made this almost completely fundamental change in the way that we develop AI systems, and we do it through machine learning. And that machine learning is what's known as reinforcement learning. You reinforce the things that are correct, and you discourage the things that aren't correct, and eventually the machine picks it up almost exactly the same way children pick up language. Now, my son can't read or write yet. He just turned 5, and he plays video games on his tablet, and he always comes to me like 5 times a minute when he's playing video games, and he'll say, "What does this say, Daddy? It popped up something on my screen," right? And I'm like, well, this is why you need to learn how to read, son. But, he doesn't, to learn how to read, you've got to have more examples. You've got to have more of that. It's a higher order type of learning than speech. So we've had a big paradigm change, and that paradigm change in machine learning has just made a massive difference in how we train these systems, and then what they're able to do as a result of that.
So that's incredibly interesting. I was going to say, one of the things that we know, if you're using the adult learning model, the human learning model, children, for example, the speech part is such an interesting area, because one of the things we know with speech is that there are motor skills associated with it that a young child in their development very often doesn't have. And this is why young kids can use sign language, for example. And they can communicate in sign language because they don't have the motor skills to actually speak, if you will. Your son may be able to understand, or kids very often can read and sort of take in information, but they have a hard time pronunciating words, et cetera. The other thing I think is really interesting, and when you talk about sort of a reinforcement model, which is, we know that there are that's how humans learn. It's sort of it's experiences and consequences, in addition to sort of historical hardwiring. So long way of saying, are we moving to that scary place where we would make the argument that the only reason that we can't sort of recreate this is we don't have either the technology or well, let me ask this. Do we have a deep enough understanding of how humans develop and learn, that the only limitation on artificial intelligence and machine learning is not our insight, but literally our tactics or our wiring, the widgets that actually make it happen? Or are we not there yet? Do we not understand human learning enough to replicate it completely?
That's a great question. And I think that one involves kind of breaking down what we mean by learning and what we mean by artificial intelligence. And so there's a couple of different kinds of artificial intelligence. And in the broadest sense, there's what we call specialized artificial intelligence. And then there's what we call general artificial intelligence. So a specialized artificial intelligence can do very specific things very well, like play chess, for instance. We can teach machines how to play chess better than any grandmaster out there. There's just no one can beat these machines. But it's a very specific domain. It's a very specific task that we've taught them. And if you tried to get them to play a different game using that same algorithm and those same machine learning models, they wouldn't be able to do anything. They would have no idea what you're talking about. It's like, let's play checkers now. Now, checkers and chess are very similar games. They're both based on a board. You've got pieces. Without additional training, that model would do horribly at checkers. It literally wouldn't know what to do. So you can't generalize the intelligence of a specialized AI into a general AI at this point. So I think we know enough now to create special purpose artificial intelligences. We're nowhere near what we need in terms of technology and understanding and software and hardware and all that stuff. We're nowhere near what we need to be where we need to be to produce general artificial intelligence. Well, and I think it's interesting when I watched my son when he was first learning how to speak. What was interesting was he would copy what my wife and I did, and he would do that, but he also started inferring rules. Mm-hmm. So he would say things like, "Daddy, I just win the game."
Yes. Right.
And I'm like, no, son, you just won the game. And he keeps doing it with this particular one. Right.
Well, English is stupid.
It is. It's very stupid, because I'm sitting there agreeing with him. I'm like, yeah, actually, that's, from a logical standpoint, you are 100% correct. I don't know why we use this other word. Or he would say things like, we would be sitting in bed at night and we'd be talking about the day. And he would say, well, last day,
yes,
I did this. And I'm like, well, we call that yesterday. And he said, well, why? I said, I have no idea why we do that. Right. It's these weird quirks in the English language that, but what I guess the point there, though, is that you can see some of his general intelligence coming out. Right. Where we're having to go teach exceptions to the rules that they've learned in a specialized area. And the world, just like the English language, is filled with exceptions. Right. There's just billions of them. There's billions of exceptions to everything that you learn as a pattern. And so being able to get to this more generalized artificial intelligence is much harder, because you have to teach the machine how to deal with all the exceptions too. And right now, we're not very good at that.
So this gets really interesting and a little bit out there. One of the things we know about humans is they're learning over the course of their lifetime. I mean, obviously, physiologically, neurologically, there are things that are happening early in life, and there are stages. Frontal cortex not fully developed until early mid-20s. All right. And we sort of say, okay, at that point, your brain's it's been developed. It still can grow and change, but it's been developed. I guess the question becomes, if you think about humans and their ability to learn all these exceptions, it happens over years and years and years, well into adulthood, literally sometimes learning until the day that they die. If you think about artificial intelligence, is there a way that we are able to pull that all back and say, we're going to write code so that you learn what a human can learn over the course of a lifetime, and we're going to try to replicate that in an instant, if you will, versus giving that machine. I mean, again, I don't know how much faster, but we know that humans is going to take sometimes 50, 60, 70 years before they're going to fully grasp all the things of life. How do you do that in a machine?
Well, let's face it, most people don't ever grasp.
Well, I know. That's why.
Right? That's why the frightening part.
Yeah, that's why I have a job. That's why.
Exactly. So yeah, and it's interesting because when you look at the way kids learn, they have almost 100% what your profession, psychiatrists and psychologists, call fluid intelligence.
Right.
So fluid intelligence is the ability to learn things very quickly, to be able to adapt to different circumstances. And so they're just like little sponges. They just pick up everything. Right. And as you get older and older, more of your intelligence becomes what's called crystallized intelligence, where it's a bunch of things you have learned and you can apply those learnings from a vast repertoire of things that you've seen over time to, novel problems. And it happens. It's just part of the development of most people. The ratio of fluid intelligence to crystallized intelligence goes down over time. You get more crystallized intelligence, but your intelligence gets less fluid over time. And so when you look at it from a machine learning standpoint, though, machine learning is mostly crystallized intelligence. It's stuff that we've trained the machine to go off and know how to do. So for instance, when we go teach a computer how to play chess these days, we don't give it a million strategies pre-coded that some human has sat down and done. We simply say, here are the rules of chess. You can move these pieces to this thing, and here's the ultimate end objective of chess. And what we do is we just let it play itself billions of times. So the machine plays itself, and it creates a neural network based on successes and failures. And so if you do it enough times, it turns out you build this neural network that's so good at chess that nobody can beat it. And that's really important to realize, is that it takes, like you said, it takes all this repetition. If you do it 100 times, the computer will be terrible at chess. But if you do it 1 billion times, and you can do that with computers because they're so fast, you can very, very rapidly teach them very specific crystallized intelligence. The fluid intelligence part, though, is much more difficult. But here's the interesting part that I think, and I think this is also true of humans, and I think it's even true of organizations, because organizations generally are just collections of people, is that there's no good way of going into these neural networks and asking them, well, why did you do that? So they'll make a chess move halfway through a game, and there's no way to say to the computer, why did you make that move? It's not an explicable intelligence. And it's pretty fascinating, because you see the same thing in people. And you see the same thing sometimes in organizations. Well, why did you do that? And a fair bit of time, people will come up with justifications for what they do after the fact, but they don't actually know why they did certain things either. And so that's kind of the dark side of AI and machine learning, is that there's no good way to go in and make the computer explain why it chose to do something, because to it, the computer doesn't really know it's playing chess. It doesn't really know it's driving a car. It just knows that there's certain inputs and certain outputs, and certain inputs will lead to certain outputs that achieve success for whatever it is you happen to be doing. They don't know why. And I think that's one of the big differences between machine intelligence and human intelligence, is that a lot of times humans can actually tell you why they did something, and they've got a justification for it. Whereas machines, there's no justification for it, and there's no good way for us to introspect into those AI systems and ask them, well, why did you do that thing? All we can do is teach them that was either the right thing or the wrong thing to do.
So, all right. So let's get really super psychologically deep on this one, because I think this is something where we potentially perfect or get rid of one of the biggest failures, if you will, in human behavior. Let me step that back, because it's not a failure. It's where we sometimes go awry. It's the rationalizations. It's the defense mechanisms. It's the weighing of the action versus the social consequences, right? It's where people twist themselves up. It's insecurities and defensiveness, and so many of those psychological, emotional factors, whether a business leader likes it or not, is what drives people to do what they do, including our leaders, right? So overcompensating for things where they're insecure, making mistakes and then doubling down and defending them, literally convincing yourself that what you've done has a rationalization and a justification because it's self preserving. There's a preservation factor there. There's literally an adaptation there because you're adapting to the social circumstance. Well, okay, throw all that crap out there, right? Take all that away. And what about artificial intelligence? We don't need any of that, or do we?
Well, I think we do. I mean, I think one of the neat things is, you have to view artificial intelligence. We were talking in a previous episode about Six Sigma and some of the dangers of trying to quantify everything. And so we said, you've got to look at something like that as a tool rather than a philosophy. And I think it's the same thing with artificial intelligence. There's a lot of people, and there's been a lot of press over the last 3 or 4 years about how, AI is going to take everybody's jobs and so on and so forth. And we're all going to be out of work and it's just going to be a disaster. And that hasn't really happened. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't happened is because you still need the fluid intelligence. And that's what we're good at as humans. We're really good at fluid intelligence. You give us a thing we've never, ever seen before, and we have this amazing ability to sit down with it, a puzzle or whatever it happens to be, and work it out, even though we've never seen anything like it. And so I think, when you look at artificial intelligence and machine learning as a tool that allows us to have even more crystallized intelligence and be able to do things that maybe we're not good at, but the machines are really good at, that's where you create a great partnership. Because I don't think we're going to get to a general artificial intelligence in our lifetimes. I would be willing to bet everything I have that that's not going to happen. It may never happen.
I'm laughing because how many of our episodes where I need to stop. Okay, timestamp that one.
Timestamp to put that one in the time capsule. You're right. But I'm going to make a bold prediction. We're not going to see artificial general intelligence. So we're not going to see human level fluid intelligence in our lifetimes. But we will see this ability to create crystallized intelligence advance very rapidly. And I think we're seeing this. A really good example of this is in self-driving cars. Elon Musk stood up 3 or 4 years ago, and I like Elon. I think he's a really, really smart guy, demonstrably, but he's also just a cool dude. But he has a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver sometimes. And he said 3 or 4 years ago, by 2020, we're going to have these self-driving cars, and it's going to be amazing, and they'll be fully autonomous. And then he had to come back last year and say, well, you know what? This problem's actually more difficult than we thought. And I think one of the reasons it's more difficult than they thought was that they figured out the crystallized intelligence part. They said, okay, we can make this thing drive down the road and stop at stop signs and all that good stuff, all the standard stuff you do when you drive a car. It's all the weird exceptions that happen that humans are so good at figuring out that the AIs are really bad at figuring out. So this unexpected circumstance or these use cases that aren't part of sort of the happy path use cases of driving a car, that's where the AIs really fall down. And so we kind of had to backtrack on that and say, well, we're close, but it's still going to take us some time. And I think that's what we find in a lot of these situations is that we underestimate how hard that fluid intelligence part of it's going to be. But again, that's what humans are great at. So when you look at it from an organizational standpoint, it kind of forces us to say, what can only humans do right now? And then what can we turn the machines loose on and create a great partnership there that's a virtuous cycle rather than a downward spiral where people are losing their jobs and there's all these big societal impacts. And I think as long as we look at it that way, I think we'll be in good shape. And going back to your topic on people not necessarily being able to explain what they're doing or explain why they're doing something, I think rock bands are a great example of this. Right. You get these people that come together to create music, and some of the stories behind some of these bands are just legendary, right? The conflicts they had, the falling out. I mean, it's gone on throughout the history of music. And I think what we're seeing there is the reason that there's so much conflict, the reason that there's so much I don't know, sometimes divisiveness within bands. I think it's true in organizations, but I think it's really true in music because by definition, you're dealing with a bunch of really creative, really fluid thinkers. They have a lot of fluid intelligence. It's not just crystallized intelligence of music. It's that fluidity to be able to spark new ideas and create new things. So you put all these really creative types that have all this fluid intelligence together, and you end up with a lot of conflict. You end up with a lot of emotion. You end up with a lot of, people not being able to explain why they're doing things. And, you read these interviews with bands or band members, and it's amazing how much of that goes on in the music industry. And I think that's part of the reason why is that it's such a high degree of fluid intelligence that you're almost designing that in when you bring people like that together.
So that's really interesting because if you think about it, much like in an organization, we take a musical group or a musician, and we say that, he or she or the band, they need to have that creativity. They need to be able to be fluid. They need to be able to be inspired where and whenever. And sometimes there's dry spells and it just kind of goes. But at the same time, we say in order for them to be financially successful, their organization runs they're big businesses, right? They've got the people behind them that are doing those parts of it. Otherwise, you just have amazing talents that are essentially the starving artists who never go anywhere from a business standpoint. Now, they may be very happy and satisfied because all they want to do is create their art and their product. But you have to put the two together if they're going to sort of function, if you will, in our society from a business standpoint. That being said, and now we're going way off topic, though, when you think about an organization and you put a great band in an organization, so you put, okay, fine, we'll use Styx. We use Styx, we can use the Eagles, we can use any of them. What are their titles? Are they the CEOs? They're clearly not COOs. Are they the CMOs? Where do you put the people that are actually creating the product? But it's not really a product till it gets out to the people. So what is Mick Jagger in an organization? Is he chairman of the board, or what would you say?
Well, I'm not sure there's a good analogy there, right? I mean, I think that the interesting thing about musicians is that they play a lot of different roles. They play a lot of roles that you don't necessarily see in an organization or don't necessarily, but I think what they're an interesting example of are self-managing teams. And the idea of self-managing teams is an amazing concept. It's not that you have to have this big hierarchical structure. You've actually got teams that can manage themselves. And yes, there's going to be conflict. Yes, there's going to be falling out, but that's a good thing. I think that this idea of creative conflict within a band or within an organization, I think there's a lot we can learn from an organizational psychology standpoint by looking at bands because, it's kind of a meeting of equals. There's no CEO. There's no chairman of the board. There's no, you get people that are sort of on an equal footing and they all have their own part and they have to interact and they basically have to manage themselves. And so I think that's a big trend today in organizations is how do we create self-managing teams? And I think we can look at the music industry as a really interesting example, maybe not the best example, but certainly an example of how this can go really well and also how it can really go horribly wrong. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's just pivot off of that. We can think about sports teams too. You're talking about sort of relatively equal. Yeah, but what about the lead singer? Who's fronting the band, and is he or she more important than the bassist, who's more important than the drummer, unless the drummer is also singing leads, or unless you have a band like the Eagles where they're playing all the instruments, they all do everything, and they all, or you have a band like Rush. Well, but Rush would be a little bit different. It's interesting that you describe that because I feel like maybe much like an organization, musicians who are successful commercially figure out how to navigate that conflict. They're the ones who have the honest conversations, or the ones who can stand the test of time, right? This is why we see band members rotating in and out. It's essentially people getting fired or people quitting or whatever. But the ones who can ride the storm, and you're right, in business, I mean, in music, talk about being stuck with somebody 24/7 and being on the road, again, at least with work, for the most part, you can go home, or, even in a startup, you're not living in a van with them. Yeah. So it's really interesting because I guess we would say for all the ones that are successful, we're not seeing much, I guess, like a startup company, we're not seeing the bands who've never been able to navigate that conflict. And maybe we don't see, because this is sort of the TMZ version, we're not seeing what's going on behind the scenes, much like at an organization, very successful, everything's going great, but behind the scenes, you pull back the curtain and it's kind of a shit show.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think it goes to, I think it really plays on the idea that, most companies and most organizations in general, they have a management philosophy and they have a structuring philosophy that they assume is good for every part of their business. And I think that's a really poor assumption. I think there are teams of people that, again, when you get these people that have a very high degree of fluid intelligence and you need that for a particular department or a task, self-managing teams become a lot more appealing because you're able to harness the energy and the collective insights of those very highly fluid intelligences within the organization. And that gives you the ability to go out and do some pretty miraculous things. I mean, it's astounding when you get a bunch of really smart, really fluid thinkers together. But at the same time, there may be other parts of your business where you need a much, much higher degree of crystallized intelligence. And again, I think it's the same thing when you look at it from an artificial intelligence standpoint. There are things that machines do really well, and that's a lot of the crystallized intelligence we've been talking about. And there's things that humans do really well, which is more the fluid intelligence. But what I think is interesting is when you start looking at this from an educational standpoint. And if you look at education today, and my son goes to preschool, he's in pre-K, he'll be in kindergarten next year. What's really interesting is that the older we get, the more we put an educational emphasis on crystallized intelligence. And we're trying to cram all of these facts and figures and stuff into people's heads as we educate them throughout their lives. And this is including adult education. And I think what we really need to be doing is saying, you know what, the machines will probably work that out. You don't have to necessarily know all that. What are we doing to increase the skills that you can use from a fluid intelligence standpoint in our kids and in our adults as we teach them? How do we do a better job of teaching fluid intelligence? Because that's what makes us uniquely human, at least at this point. So I think we've got to do a better job of doing that, both from an educational standpoint for young people, but also as we educate people within corporations. It's not just about cramming as many skills as you possibly can in people's heads. It's about also teaching them to think fluidly and to have a culture that supports that fluid thinking. And again, you go back to music, that's almost a perfect example of learning through fluid intelligence. Bands don't start out with the song already written and then they just tweak it. It's this organic process where they have to create these songs, and it's this interplay. And sometimes you run into a dead end and you just throw that song away because it sucks and it's never going to go anywhere. And some songs you start writing them and the guitar player will do a couple of chords and then somebody else will do another. And then they finally find a nice little, riff that they're going to do as the basis of the song. And then they write some lyrics. So it's this very organic, very fluid process to create music. And I think we have to be thinking more in the business world about how do we do that with new products, new ideas, new go-to-market strategies, having that same jam session mentality. We call it brainstorming in the corporate world, but I think it's something different, right? It's almost like a jam session where you sit down and it might seem like a waste of time, but at the end of the day, you can come up with some pretty amazing stuff that can come out of those. And that's all about this fluid intelligence that humans are so good at.
Okay, only Alex Heublein, Dr. Alex Heublein, could start off with AI and machine learning wrap that around into child development and his own personal experiences with his son, and then bring it back home with classic rock bands, and the business and creativity of it. I'm gonna just like, that was a mic drop. That was, you need to, as you're listening to this on Tony Curry Radio, you then also need to go get the podcast. You need to listen to the podcast over and over again, because this one, of all the shows we've done, this was, you just shined in this one. This was all of the aspects of Dr. Alex Heublein. Unfortunately, we don't have more time to go, so you're going to have to join us again. This is the end of today's Adapt or Perish, but if you stay tuned to Tony Curry Radio, you're going to get another episode. It's going to be amazing, and it's Adapt or Perish.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Curry Radio.